You get sermon ideas from a lot of places. I get a lot of them from articles that I read, from different experiences that I have. Last week I had an experience that caused me to have an idea, and I kind of cultivated it more and more in my mind and decided that I would use that idea this morning, and it may seem a bit strange to you. We're going to talk about why mow your grass regularly. I was mowing my grass, and because of the rain, I actually mowed it last Monday. And I mowed it again on Saturday. And I noticed all during the week people were having the same experience that I had. And that was that it did not look very good when you mowed it because it simply was too tall. And so as you mowed it, unless you want to go and rake it, and even if you raked it, you had some of that clumpy grass that when you let it get too tall and then you cut it off, it doesn't look very good anyway, even if you do rake it, that it really doesn't look very good. And I got to thinking about that, and I got to thinking about how it's kind of the way it is with our lives sometimes. If we are kind of religious and a little bit interested in God, but don't really pay too much attention to Him, and just every now and then things get pretty rough, and so we kind of give a little attention to cultivating our souls. They kind of end up like that grass. It doesn't look as good, and it's not quite as good a job as it could have been. But then I got to thinking about all the people in the Old and New Testament, and I kind of settled down to the idea that, of all the people that I'm aware of in the inspired text, I think Samson would be probably the best illustration that I could think of in this particular regard. So I decided that when I'm talking about why you mow your grass regularly, that we would talk about Samson. And you may think that to be a far stretch, but I don't believe you will when I get through. Well, of course, obviously, the reason you mow your grass regularly, because if you mow it regularly, there's a lot of things that would be true. Think of it. If you mow it regularly, it's relatively easy to maintain. When you don't mow it regularly, like yesterday when I would mow, I think some of the areas I mowed probably 4 to 5 times. Go back over and over and over, just trying to get rid of the grass without having to go get a rake and rake it all up. And even then, it doesn't look as good as it would have if I'd have just mowed it on probably Thursday instead of Saturday. And the second thing is that even if I do everything I can do, and it's a great deal more difficult, it takes a lot more time, it still does not look as good as it would if I had done it regularly and I just run over it very quickly. It would look better than it does now. And I kind of got to thinking about the fact that when you mow sporadically, it just becomes a bigger chore and it looks ragged when you get through. Now, that's really true. And it occurred to me that my life is kind of like that, too, that the closer you are to God, the more you incorporate His will into your life, the easier it is to maintain faithfulness and the greater influence you are for good. Now, you think about that. You just consider it. A lot of people just really are not very diligent in mowing their grass. And so therefore their yard never really looks very good, and it works them to death when they finally get around to it. A lot of people are not very diligent in their life. They kind of want to be what God wants them to be. Don't pay much attention to it most of the time, and then they get themselves in a big mess, and then they try to straighten it out. And then they kind of straighten it out, but there's still a lot of ragged edges that's left that really you just can't camouflage and you can't hide. Well, when you look at Samson, you're going to see a person that's very much descriptive of. You would think, because obviously if you were to think of Bible characters that are well known, he probably is one of the best known Bible characters that there are. Would you like to know how many times Samson is mentioned in the New Testament? He is mentioned once. Only once. The only mention that is made of Samson in the New Testament is in Hebrews chapter 11. Now, he is in good company, I would have to say. Now, I don't know what we can read between the lines and what we can't. But because of where he's listed and the way he's listed, it really seems that he was pleasing in the sight of God, and therefore he is called one of the great heroes of faith. And He is mentioned along with Gideon, Barak, Jephthah, David, and Samuel, and the prophets. And his name is right in almost the dead center of that writing. And it says that these people, through faith, subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Now he's mentioned in good company, without question. But only one mention made of Samson in the New Testament. So everything we're going to say about him in the next few minutes is in the Old Testament. And we're not going to read everything that's said about him. We're not going to talk about every story that you are already familiar with. But we're going to point out some things that I think are interesting, but you need to think about. You know, what did his faith do? The faith that Samson had enabled him to subdue the enemies of God and to fulfill God's promise when his people repented of sin and turned to him. Now that's what he did. That is, he had a great effect upon the history of the nation of Israel, without any question. Back in the book of Judges, and most of everything that you read about Samson really in the New Testament, I would think begins, in the Old Testament rather, begins in chapter 13 and goes through chapter 17. But in chapter 16 there, and verse 30, the thing that you remember most about him is he delivered the people of God from their enemies. At this time, the enemies were the Philistines. And you remember how he did it. He actually went into the temple in which all the dignitaries of the nation of the Philistines were assembled. He was so strong and so powerful that he was able to get between the pillars and actually just pull them in. He bowed himself with all his might. The house fell upon the lords, upon all the people that were therein. So the dead which he slew at his death were more than they which he slew in his life. And effectively it ended the Philistine dominance of the nation of Israel at that time, which had occurred because of the sinfulness of the people. But the people had repented, and God had raised up Samson to be the judge that would deliver them. But I want to go back a little bit. And I want to look at what's stated in Leviticus chapter 26. And I want you to consider a few lines there. And I want you to think about what's involved in this. In verse 27 of Leviticus 26, God had said about His nation to which He was giving His covenant, if ye will not at all this hearken unto me, but walk contrary unto me, then I will walk contrary unto you in fury. Even I will chastise you 7 times for your sins. You shall eat the flesh of your sons, the flesh of your daughters shall you eat, and I will destroy your high places, cut down your images, cast your carcasses upon the carcasses of your idols, and my soul shall abhor you. And I will make your cities waste and bring your sanctuaries into desolation. I will not smell the savor of your sweet odors, talking about the sacrifices in the temple. I will bring the land into desolation. Your enemies which dwell therein shall be astonished at it. I will scatter you among the heathen and will draw out a sword after you, and your land shall be desolate and your cities waste. He probably was talking primarily about the destruction of Samaria and Jerusalem at a much later date. But in the meantime, several times you saw a smaller scale of that happening. And this, in the case of the time of Samuel, was one of those times. The people had just ignored God, become involved in all forms of idolatry, and God rose up the Philistines and they conquered him. And then the people repented and cried out to God for deliverance. And God says what would happen if they would, in verse 40. If they shall confess their iniquity, the iniquity of their fathers, with their trespasses which they have trespassed against me, that they also have walked contrary to me, that I also have walked contrary to them and have brought them to the land of their enemies, and in their uncircumcised hearts if their uncircumcised hearts be humbled, and they accept of the punishment of their iniquity, then will I remember my covenant with Jacob, and also my covenant with Isaac, and also my covenant with Abraham will I remember, and I will remember the land. The land also shall be left of them, and shall enjoy her Sabbaths when she lieth desolate without them. and they shall accept the punishment of their iniquity, because even they despise my judgments, and because their soul abhorred my statutes. And yet for all that, when they be in the land of their enemies, I will not cast them away, neither will I abhor them, to destroy them utterly, and to break my covenant with them, for I am the Lord their God. But I will, for their sakes, remember the covenant of their ancestors, whom I brought forth out of the land of Egypt in the sight of the heathen, and I might be their God. I am the Lord. So basically he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, I realize. But on a much smaller scale, you really see that happening over and over and over again. And Samson was one of those cases where the people had ignored God. They had been actually dominated by the Philistines, which was their next door neighbors. They had been brought under their rule and under their power. And then Samson was raised for the purpose of restoring them. That is, of fulfilling God's promise to bless them. Because Samson was not steadfast in his faith, his life left a lot to be desired. Now here's the thing. There's no question that the people benefited greatly by what Samson did. I understand that. And in the final analysis, he was a great blessing to the people of God. I understand that. But I want to tell you something about Samson. His life was kind of like a yard that you just mowed sporadically. Just every now and then you paid a little attention, the rest of the time you ignored it. When you look back and you read, the only thing of which I'm aware that anybody ever praises Samson for is that final act of his life. The rest of the time, he kept having some problems, which is a little bit surprising, because let's think of some things. Number one, if you go over to the book of Judges chapter 13, being a Nazarite was considered to be a person who was completely devoted to the service of God. Not only was Samson a Nazarite from his mother's womb, he actually was a Nazarite in his mother's womb. God wanted to make a statement. And so here in verse 1 through 7, there was a certain man of Zorah, the family of the Danites, whose name was Manoah. His wife was barren and bare not. And the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said unto her, Behold, now thou art barren and bearest not, but thou shalt conceive and bear a son. Now therefore, notice what he said, Beware, I pray thee, and drink not wine nor strong drink, and eat not any unclean thing. For lo, thou shalt conceive and bear a son, and no razor shall come upon his head. It was the way that you designated the person as a Nazarite, was that you did not cut their hair. For the child shall be a Nazarite unto God from the womb, and shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines. Then the woman came and told her husband, saying, A man of God came unto me, and his countenance was like the countenance of an angel of God, very terrible. But I asked him not whence he was, neither told me his name. But he said unto me, Behold, thou shalt conceive. So she had not conceived as of yet, and bear a son. Now drink no wine nor strong drink, neither eat any unclean thing, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb to the day of his death. Now that's astounding. What does that mean? That means that he was to be dedicated and devoted to the service of God. Now he actually was. He accomplished the purpose for which God sent him. But he had a little bit of a problem. The problem that Samson had was that he had a great lust for women. In this particular case, it was not the women of his people, but it was the women of the Philistines, who were the folks who actually had been the oppressors of God's people. So in chapter 14 and verse 1, he gets of age, he goes and he sees a woman of Timnath, the daughter of the Philistines, and he came up and told his father and mother, I have seen a woman in Timnath, the daughters of the Philistines, now therefore get her for me to wife. Then his father and his mother said unto them, Is there never a woman among the daughters of thy brethren, or among all my people? Wilt thou goest to take a wife of the uncircumcised Philistines? And Samson said unto his father, Get her from me, for she pleaseth me well. And his father and his mother knew not that it was of the Lord that he sought an occasion against the Philistines, for at that time the Philistines had dominion over Israel. Now it's kind of interesting about a number of things. You know, on Sunday mornings we've been studying the providence of God, and one of the things we've noticed in the providence of God that a lot of times folks that God used were not always people who were aware that they were being tools of God. And the people that He used were not always people who were actually serving God as a faithful servant of God. They sometimes were like Samson, who really had some problems, but what they were doing actually turned out to be that which accomplished the purpose that God wished to accomplish. That happened here. It happened here. His desire for Philistine women led to him eventually being associated with Delilah, and eventually led to the fact that he picked a fight with the Philistines, and through a set of unforeseen circumstances ended up accomplishing the purpose of God. But in the process of all that, I tell you what happened. His life was a patchwork of misery. Now, there's no question about that. And part of the problem was he was kind of religious. He was kind of, I don't know, maybe what we would call a little bit of a lukewarm person who kind of maybe went to the synagogue went to the temple to worship once, at that time been the tabernacle, went to the tabernacle once in a while to worship. I don't know. But the fact is he wasn't very devoted. He was just kind of lukewarm, just kind of hanging on the fringes. And he eventually accomplished the purpose that God put him there for, but his life left a lot to be desired. Now, let's think about it. Let's think of the misery that Samson endured. Well, you know, he married this woman that we talked about there in chapter 14. And in the process of time, it ended up in a situation to where this woman he lost to his friend there in chapter 14 and verse 20. Samson's wife was given to his companion, and it's through a series of events that were not very pleasant. And so eventually he moves on from this situation and he marries another woman. In this particular case, it would be Delilah. And this woman actually, Delilah betrayed him in the hand of his enemies. His enemies came to his wife and said, you know what? This man is so strong that we can't conquer him. And we want to know why. And so she began to question him and constantly, for lack of a better word, just nag him and nag him and nag him and wear down his defenses until eventually he tells her why his strength was there and what would happen if those circumstances were removed. And everybody here knows what was the source of his strength. He was a Nazarite. He never cut his hair from the time of his birth. And God had said basically that if you cut it, then you're going to be like other men. You won't have that superhuman strength that's necessary for you to accomplish what I'm hoping that, what I've determined for you to accomplish. So in chapter 16 and verse 18, finally when Delilah is given the information that she cajoles out of him, and she understands at this time, though he's told her several lies in the past, really just kind of toying with her about what would work, and you remember the story, how that none of it did, and his strength was not taken, but he finally tells her, and she knows it. She immediately knows it. When Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she understood, you know what, he told me the truth this time. She sent and called for the lords of the Philistines, saying, come up this once, for he hath known, he has shown me all his heart. Now the Lord of the Philistines came up unto her and brought her money in their hand. They were bribing her with financial reward to betray her husband. And she made him sleep upon her knees. She called for a man. She caused him to shave off the 7 locks of his head. And she began to afflict him, and his strength went from him. And she said, the Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And when he awoke out of his sleep and said, I will go out as at other times before and shake myself, and he was not, that the Lord was departed from him. You know, one of the things that sometimes we don't think about is this. I don't know how old Samson was at this time. But I would kind of gather by the relating of the story and how the events unfolded, he was a pretty young guy. My guess is he probably was 30 years old or younger when all this occurred. Now, the interesting thing is that, he's had a pretty wild life. He's kind of like the prodigal son. He's had a big time. And he probably thought, man, I've got the world by the tail. Everything's great. But his world crumbled at this particular time. And the problem was, if he'd been devoted to God. Have you ever thought about and just think back to, and I realize that hindsight is 20/20. Suppose he had grown up and he had really respected that Nazarite vow and said, I've been devoted to God and I'm going to devote myself to God. Suppose he had married some nice Jewish girl that shared his faith. They went to the temple regularly, as did the parents of Samuel later. And suppose that he had, when he got to a certain age, that God had chosen a way whereby he could destroy the Philistines without his whole life being destroyed before him. Just think of how different that would have been. So that later, when Samson would get to be an old man, he'd be proverbially sitting at the rocking chair at the front of his tent, looking at his grandchildren playing, thinking, boy, they look back to the time I destroyed those Philistines. But that's not the way it worked. And why did it not? Well, really, he kind of like an unmowed grass. I mean, he kind of paid a little bit of attention to God, a little bit here and there, but he really didn't pay much attention. He wasn't very serious about it. It was like something that was just kind of it was just there, but not too important. You know what happened? When he was a very young man, the Philistines came, they took him from his house, or from his tent. They put out his eyes, they brought him down to Gaza, they bound him with fetters of brass, and he did grind in the prison house. He was basically a prisoner of war. For how many years? I do not know. Now, I can't imagine any more misery than that. Can you? I can't. I mean, a person had his eyes put out when he was a young guy and carried and put into a prison house. And what I understand that to mean was grinding. Usually meant that they would grind with corn or grain of some sort. And in this particular case, it would just be that they would use human power to turn the grinding wheel. And that would be something probably 14 hours a day. Pretty rough life. Not much pleasant there. Now you go and you think, and you stop and you think, well, why did all this come about? Well, he finally he's able to accomplish the mission of his life in chapter 16 and verse 30, which is mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11 as being a great act of faith. So finally we get back to where we began. And Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. He bowed himself with all his might, and the house fell upon the Lord. Now, how old he was at that time, I don't know. But his hair had grown back, and maybe it suggests that he'd grown back to the length it was originally. If that be true, it might have been that he was 60 years old at the time. I don't know. Don't have any idea. He still accomplished the purpose of God, but it's kind of like a raggedy yard. It got cut. But the problem was that it wasn't pretty. I mean, this is not a pretty life. Samson's life's not a pretty life. I mean, you can't whitewash it and you can't make it pretty. And all the kids who get so excited about the strength of Samson, and you tell them that story, and they get, especially young boys, they just get overwhelmed. He's almost like a superhero or the Incredible Hulk in their mind. But if they get to be an adult and they look back and they consider that one act of pulling that in and look at the rest of his life and the way it was lived, it wasn't a pretty sight. It's kind of like your grass when you don't mow it for a month or two and you go and mow it. I remember one time Brian's yard got so bad and I called Judy and asked her to come. They were still mowing grass and she mowed it and it looked terrible. And she told me, don't ever call me again if you wait that long to mow it. It looked bad. You know, you've really got to be on top of something. If you want your life as a Christian to be one that's a great influence to other people, then you can't just once in a while just say, I'll attend a worship service, or I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do... I mean, it has to be a matter of constant attention. And if you don't, you kind of may end up like Samson. You may end up saved eternally. That could happen. I want you to think about something. You need to maintain your lawn regularly. I thought I was doing that this year until we had so much rain, and I didn't wait but from Monday to Saturday. It wouldn't be but, 5 days between? But it makes your life easier just to bite the bullet and do it on a constant basis. And you're going to have a better outcome. I know of a fella, I've mentioned this several times, but I'm going to mention it again in a different context. I'm not his judge. God is. And when he dies, God will be his judge and I won't. So I don't know. I'm just telling you from the outside looking in and saying what he's told me. I know a fella that became involved in homosexual practices, was a gospel preacher, lost his family, and spent years in exile. Later repented of that, and I haven't seen him in several years, but unless something changed, he's now a faithful Christian again. But if you look at his life, it's kind of like that yard you didn't maintain continually. It's pretty ragged looking. Now, will he be saved eternally? If he lives faithfully before God, he will. But if he had a choice to go back and undo that, I can tell you right now he would. And I can tell you this, that if Samson, when he was standing in at that grinding wheel and thinking about the mistakes that he had made, I'll guarantee you, I know human nature well enough to know, why did I do that? Why was there so much misconduct in my life? I mean, even as he pulled down those walls and he accomplishes the purpose of God. And Hebrews 11 suggests, I mean, I don't know the answer to whether he's saved or not. I'm not going to tell you he wasn't, but Hebrews 11 suggests that he was one of the faithful ones. I mean, you reach your own conclusions. But let's just assume for the purposes of argument that right now, when the judgment scene occurs, that Samson will be one that God says, enter into the joys of thy Lord. It's still kind of like a yard not mowed regularly. It comes out with the right result, but it's a pretty ragged experience. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. Which life would you prefer to have? Would you prefer to have a life of a person who's devoted to God? Look back, for example, to Samuel. Samuel was a person somewhat similar. His mother devoted him to the Lord and gave him to the Lord when he was a young child, probably 3 years old. And he was raised in the temple. Now, I'm not saying he's a perfect man, but you look at his life, and you really don't have much to criticize about it. Now, you can criticize him for the way he raised his sons, and I understand that, but you look at the way he conducted himself overall, he kind of has a life that was a great influence. But that's not true of Samson. You and I need to think about how important it is to devote ourselves to God, maintain our relationship with God. You know, if you will maintain your relationship with God, not only will you be saved eternally, but if you do that on a continual basis, and you don't just, maybe you live long enough that you just happen to have the opportunity to obey God and then die and be saved eternally, but you've missed out on something. The Apostle Paul says what you get in this life is it's easier to live with yourself. The peace that passeth understanding. And I tell you something. The fact is that if you live your life and you're faithful to God, now, I sit down today and I can think of a lot of things I regret in my life. I don't regret any act of faithfulness that I've ever done in my life. I don't regret a day that I faithfully served God. Everything that I regret in my life and everything that causes me to lose sleep at night, such as you do perhaps, would be the things that I was not right. Things of my life that I think back and wish they had not occurred. And like Samson, I've got some things there that I could look back to that a little bit ragged. And the less you pay attention to your life, the more ragged it's going to look. The more attention that you pay to your relationship with God, and the more consistent you are in your obedience to God, then the better it's going to look, just like you are. The Apostle Paul was a person that said he lived in all good conscience. Now, he committed some pretty grievous sins, very grievous sins early in his life. But once he obeyed, but he did it through ignorance, he said. And once he discovered the truth and he found the truth and he obeyed the truth, he was a very faithful person who paid a lot of attention. I'm not saying a perfect person, paid a lot of attention to his life. And when he was ready to die, he said this, I am ready to be offered. How many people do you know of that when they face death, they look at it, and if they know they're going to die soon, they begin to cry and wail about all the loose ends they have not tied up and all the things they had not given attention to that they should have. How ragged their yards got to looking. How many? But you know what Paul said? I'm ready to be offered. Time of my departure is in hand. I fought a good fight. I've finished my course. I've kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me at that day. Not to me only, but also unto all them that love His appearing. And not just, and I'm not saying this in a derogatory way, but it's not just that crown of righteousness, but He's looking back and thinking of, I tell you what, I don't have any regrets. I've done the best that I could. Now, I want to ask you a question, and you think about it. Do you believe I'm wrong? Do you think there'll ever come a day that you'll regret obeying God? But I'm going to tell you something. There'll come a day that if you commit sin, that you'll regret that. And there'll come a day if you've not paid attention to your soul and maintained it the way you ought to, you'll regret that. Just like when I mowed my grass Saturday, I regretted the fact I had not paid enough attention to it because it just worked me to death, and it does not look great even now. And your life's kind of like that. Give it some thought. You need to repent and obey the gospel of Jesus Christ by being baptized into Christ like those on the day of Pentecost did. I understand that. But it's more than that. And you need to be a devoted person to God. You need to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, mind, strength, and soul. That's what you need to do. And you don't need to be sporadic in it. You don't need to be just once in a while you pay a little attention to your soul and then you kind of forget about it and then you kind of live and then first thing you know you've created some terrible things and you've got to go back and undo those. You need to really devote yourself to God. Think about it as together we stand as we sing.